The dust had barely settled from the morning's work when Samuel heard the distant rumble of wagon wheels cutting through the prairie silence. His weathered hands paused on the fence post he'd been mending, calloused fingers tightening around the hammer, as his heart began its familiar dance of anticipation and dread. For 3 months he'd been exchanging letters with Miss Eleanor Whitmore from Boston, careful, measured correspondence that had slowly built into something resembling hope. Today was the day she was supposed to arrive. Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve and squinted toward the horizon where a cloud of dust marked the approaching stagecoach. His ranch, modest but well-kept, stretched across the rolling hills of Montana Territory like a promise he'd made to himself years ago when he'd first claimed this land. The house stood solid against the endless sky, its wooden walls weathered but strong, windows gleaming clean in preparation for his bride's arrival. He'd spent the better part of the week preparing. The spare room, their room, he corrected himself, had been scrubbed until the floorboards shone. Fresh linens adorned the bed, and wildflowers from the meadow beyond the creek sat in a mason jar on the windowsill. The kitchen table was set for 2, complete with his mother's good china that had survived the journey west in a trunk that now served as a coffee table in the parlor. But before we continue with Samuel's story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this tale of the Old West. And please let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. We love hearing from our listeners around the world. The stagecoach drew closer, and Samuel could make out the driver's silhouette against the afternoon sun. His pulse quickened as he imagined Eleanor's face, constructed from the careful descriptions in her letters. Auburn hair, green eyes, a gentle disposition shaped by years of teaching school in the civilized East. She'd written of her desire for adventure, for a life beyond the confines of Boston society, and Samuel had dared to believe that perhaps loneliness wasn't his permanent companion after all. As the coach rounded the final bend before his property, Samuel straightened his shoulders and walked toward the gate. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd been running this route for the better part of a decade, raised his hand in greeting. But something in Pete's expression gave Samuel pause, a mixture of amusement and bewilderment that didn't quite fit the occasion. The coach came to a stop with a creak of leather and wood, dust swirling around the wheels like a miniature cyclone. Samuel approached the door, his hat in his hands, ready to help his bride down from her long journey. But when the door swung open, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. 3 women stepped down from the coach, one after another, like a carefully choreographed dance. The first was tall and willowy, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking charge, her traveling dress practical but well-made. The second was shorter, rounder, with golden curls that had escaped their pins during the journey, and a face that seemed perpetually on the verge of laughter. The third was barely more than a girl, perhaps 16, with the same auburn hair Samuel had expected to see, but in a face far younger than he'd imagined. They stood before him in a line, travel-worn but dignified, and it was the eldest who spoke first. Her voice carried the crisp accent of New England, but there was steel beneath the refinement. "Mr. Samuel Morrison?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Samuel nodded, his voice caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. "Yes, ma'am, I was expecting—" "Eleanor Whitmore," the woman finished. "I am Margaret Whitmore, Eleanor's eldest sister. This is Catherine," she gestured to the blonde woman. "And this is Eleanor herself." The youngest sister stepped forward slightly, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Samuel's mind reeled. The Eleanor of the letters, the woman he'd been corresponding with, was little more than a child. But before he could voice his confusion, Margaret continued, "Mr. Morrison, I believe there are some things that need clarification. Eleanor did indeed write to you, and she did indeed accept your proposal of marriage. However, there are circumstances that were not fully explained in the correspondence." The afternoon sun beat down on the small group, and Samuel became acutely aware of Pete watching from his perch on the driver's seat, no doubt eager to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily overhead, its cry echoing across the prairie like a warning. "What circumstances?" Samuel managed to ask, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. It was Catherine who spoke next, her voice softer than her sister's but no less determined. "Our father died 6 months ago, Mr. Morrison. He left us with debts that consumed everything. The house, the shop, even Mother's jewelry. We have no family left in Boston, no means of support. Eleanor, the youngest, finally found her voice. It was sweeter than Samuel had imagined from her letters, but there was a tremor in it that spoke of recent tears. I wrote to you because I was desperate, Mr. Morrison, but I cannot leave my sisters. We have been together through everything, and we will not be separated now. Margaret stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance of whatever judgment might come. We come as one, Mr. Morrison. If you marry Eleanor, you take all three of us. We will work for our keep. Catherine is an excellent cook and seamstress. I can manage accounts and correspondence, and Eleanor has a good heart and will make you a faithful wife when she's old enough to truly understand what that means. The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through the prairie grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Samuel looked from one sister to another, his carefully laid plans crumbling like dust in his hands. He'd prepared for one woman, one life to intertwine with his own. Now he faced three, each with their own needs, their own stories, their own claims on the future he'd imagined. Pete cleared his throat from the driver's seat. Begging your pardon, folks, but I've got a schedule to keep. Do I need to take these ladies back to town, or are they staying? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Samuel realized that his answer would change everything, not just for himself, but for three women who had traveled across a continent with nothing but hope in each other. Margaret's eyes never left his face as she waited for his decision. Catherine's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white with tension, and Eleanor, young Eleanor with her auburn hair and green eyes, looked at him with an expression that was part plea, part apology, and part desperate hope. Samuel thought of the empty house behind him, of the years of solitude that had driven him to seek a mail-order bride in the first place. He thought of the neighbors who would talk, of the preacher who would surely have opinions about the arrangement, of the practical impossibilities of housing and feeding three women on a ranch that barely supported one man. But he also thought of the letters Eleanor had written, filled with intelligence and wit beyond her years. He thought of the courage it must have taken for three sisters to leave everything they knew and travel into the unknown. And he thought of his own loneliness, so deep and persistent that it had become like a physical ache. The decision, when it came, surprised even him. Samuel Morrison had built his ranch with his own hands, carved a life from the unforgiving prairie through sheer determination and backbreaking work. He'd faced down rustlers, survived blizzards that could kill a man in minutes, and endured years of isolation that would have broken a weaker spirit. But nothing had prepared him for the moment when three sisters stepped off a stagecoach and turned his world upside down. "Pete," he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind, "you can head back to town. The ladies are staying." The relief that washed over the three sisters was almost palpable. Eleanor's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had been lifted from them. Catherine's hands unclenched, and even Margaret's stern expression softened slightly. But Samuel knew that accepting them was only the beginning of a much larger challenge. As Pete drove away with a tip of his hat and what Samuel was sure was a smirk, the four of them stood in the settling dust, each lost in their own thoughts about what came next. The ranch that had seemed so ready for one bride now felt woefully inadequate for three women, each with their own needs and expectations. "Well then," Margaret said, breaking the silence with characteristic directness, "perhaps you could show us where we'll be staying." Samuel led them toward the house, acutely aware of how small it must seem to women accustomed to city life. The main room served as both kitchen and parlor, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, and shelves lined with the few books he'd managed to accumulate over the years. The bedroom he'd prepared for Eleanor suddenly seemed presumptuous, and he found himself wondering where the other two sisters would sleep. Catherine, however, seemed delighted by everything she saw. "Oh, it's charming," she exclaimed, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the kitchen table. "And so clean. You must be very organized, Mr. Morrison." "Just Samuel," he said automatically, then caught himself. The informality that came naturally with ranch hands and neighbors suddenly seemed inappropriate with these refined Eastern women. Eleanor had wandered to the window that looked out over the rolling hills, her young face thoughtful as she took in the vast expanse of prairie. "It's so different from Boston," she murmured. "So endless. It can be overwhelming at first," Samuel admitted. "But there's a freedom in it too. A man can breathe out here, make his own choices without the whole world watching." Margaret was examining the house with a practical eye. no doubt calculating sleeping arrangements and storage space. "Mr. Morrison, Samuel, we should discuss the particulars of our arrangement. Eleanor is still quite young, as you can see. The marriage would be in name only until she reaches a more appropriate age." Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd assumed as much from Eleanor's youthful appearance, but hearing it stated so bluntly made the unusual nature of their situation even more apparent. "Of course," he said. "I'm not a man who would take advantage." "I didn't think you were," Margaret replied, and there was approval in her voice. "Your letters suggested a man of honor, and Eleanor's judgment, young as she is, has always been sound." As the afternoon wore on, the sisters began to settle in with an efficiency that spoke of long practice in adapting to new circumstances. Catherine immediately set about preparing supper from the supplies Samuel had laid in, humming softly as she worked. Margaret examined his account books with the keen eye of someone who understood business, making occasional notes in a small leather journal she produced from her traveling bag. Eleanor helped where she could, but Samuel noticed she often paused to stare out the windows at the endless sky. The first meal they shared was a revelation. Catherine's cooking transformed Samuel's simple provisions into something approaching a feast, and the conversation around the table was livelier than anything the house had heard in years. Margaret spoke of their father's business, a small but successful dry goods store that had been their family's pride until his sudden death. Catherine shared stories of the ladies' auxiliary at their church, her natural warmth making even the most mundane anecdotes entertaining. Eleanor, though quieter than her sisters, showed flashes of the intelligence and humor that had come through in her letters. But as the evening progressed, the practical realities of their situation became impossible to ignore. The house had only one bedroom, and while Samuel was prepared to sleep in the barn, the question of where three women would find privacy and comfort remained unanswered. It was Margaret who addressed the issue with typical directness. "We'll need to make some modifications to the house," she said as they cleared the supper dishes. "Catherine and I can share the main bedroom for now, and Eleanor can sleep in the parlor until we can arrange something more permanent." "I can build another room," Samuel offered. "It won't be fancy, but it would give you more space." "That's very kind," Margaret replied. "But we don't want to be a burden. We intend to contribute to the household, not merely consume its resources." And contribute they did. Within a week, the sisters had transformed the ranch in ways Samuel could never have imagined. Catherine's cooking drew compliments from the neighboring ranchers who stopped by, and her skill with a needle meant that clothes were mended and improved rather than simply endured. Margaret took over the ranch's bookkeeping with an efficiency that freed Samuel to focus on the physical demands of running cattle and maintaining the property. Even young Eleanor proved her worth, tending a garden that soon provided fresh vegetables and herbs that added both nutrition and flavor to their meals. But it was the less tangible changes that affected Samuel most profoundly. The house that had echoed with emptiness now rang with laughter and conversation. Evenings that had once stretched endlessly were filled with reading aloud, card games, and discussions that ranged from practical matters to philosophical questions that Samuel had never considered. The neighbors, of course, had opinions about the arrangement. Some were scandalized by the idea of a man living with three unmarried women, even if one was technically his wife. Others were simply curious about how such an unusual household functioned. But Samuel found that he cared less about their opinions than he'd expected. The sisters had brought life to his ranch in ways that went far beyond the practical contributions they made. There were challenges, certainly. Privacy was at a premium, and the delicate dance of maintaining propriety while building genuine relationships required constant attention. Margaret's protective instincts sometimes clashed with Samuel's authority as head of the household, leading to tense conversations about everything from Eleanor's education to the ranch's financial priorities. Catherine's cheerful nature occasionally masked a homesickness that she tried to hide, but that Samuel learned to recognize in the way she lingered over letters from friends back east. And Eleanor herself remained something of a mystery. She was clearly intelligent and capable, but her youth showed in moments of uncertainty and the way she sometimes seemed overwhelmed by the vastness of her new life. Samuel found himself in the strange position of being both her husband and something approaching a guardian, a role that required a delicacy he'd never needed to develop. As autumn approached, bringing with it the promise of a harsh Montana winter, Samuel realized that what had begun as a desperate arrangement was evolving into something resembling a family. Not the traditional family he'd imagined when he first wrote to Eleanor, but something uniquely their own, bound together by circumstance, sustained by mutual respect, and strengthened by the shared challenges of frontier life. The turning point came on a crisp October morning when Samuel discovered Eleanor sitting on the porch steps, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a letter in her trembling hands. He approached carefully, unsure whether his comfort would be welcome or appropriate. "What's wrong?" he asked gently, settling beside her on the steps. Eleanor looked up at him with eyes red from crying. "It's from Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor back in Boston. She writes that our house, our old house, has been sold to strangers. They've torn down the garden where Mother grew her roses, and they're planning to build a larger structure." Samuel understood. The last tangible connection to her old life was gone, making her exile to the frontier complete and irreversible. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "I know it's foolish," Eleanor continued, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "We couldn't have kept the house anyway, and we're better off here than we would have been trying to survive in Boston. But it feels like losing Mother all over again." Without thinking, Samuel reached out and covered her small hand with his larger one. "It's not foolish. A home is more than just a building. It's all the memories and love that filled it. No one can tear that down." Eleanor looked at him with surprise, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You understand. I left my family's farm in Ohio to come here," Samuel said. "I know what it's like to lose the place where you grew up, to have to build something new from nothing." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun climb higher over the prairie. Finally, Eleanor spoke again, her voice stronger than before. "Samuel, I want you to know that I'm grateful for what you've done for us. I know this isn't what you expected when you agreed to marry me." "No," Samuel admitted, "it's not what I expected, but I'm not sorry it happened this way." Eleanor smiled then, the first truly radiant smile he'd seen from her since the sisters' arrival. "Neither am I." That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Margaret made an announcement that surprised them all. "I've been corresponding with Mr. Patterson at the bank in town," she said, her tone businesslike, but with an undercurrent of excitement. "He's mentioned that they're looking for someone to help with their bookkeeping, particularly someone with experience in inventory management. I believe I'm qualified for the position." Samuel set down his fork, considering the implications. "It would mean traveling to town several times a week." "Yes, but it would also mean additional income for the household, and it would allow me to contribute in a way that uses my particular skills." Catherine looked worried. "But Margaret, you've never worked outside the home before." "Neither had any of us done many things before we came here," Margaret replied with a slight smile. "I think it's time we all learned to adapt." The conversation that followed revealed how much each of them had been thinking about their future, both individually and as a family unit. Catherine had been experimenting with preserving and canning techniques that could potentially be sold at the town market. Eleanor had been reading Samuel's agricultural journals and had ideas about crop rotation and soil improvement that could increase the ranch's productivity. As winter settled over the ranch with its characteristic Montana ferocity, the household found its rhythm. Margaret's work at the bank brought in additional income and connected them more closely to the town's social and economic life. Catherine's preserved goods became popular at the market, earning both money and respect from the community. Eleanor continued her education through correspondence courses that Margaret had arranged, preparing for a future that was still undefined but full of possibility. Samuel found himself marveling at how completely his life had changed. The solitary existence that had once defined him seemed like a distant memory. The house that had echoed with emptiness now buzzed with activity and conversation. Even the work of the ranch felt different when shared with people who cared about its success. But it was during the long winter evenings that the most significant changes occurred. Gathered around the fireplace, the four of them would read aloud, play cards, or simply talk about their dreams and fears. Samuel learned that Margaret harbored ambitions beyond bookkeeping. She dreamed of opening her own business, perhaps a boarding house for travelers. Catherine spoke wistfully of the children she hoped to have someday, and her natural maternal instincts often focused on Eleanor, who was still growing into womanhood. Eleanor herself was changing most dramatically of all. The frightened girl who had stepped off the stagecoach was developing into a thoughtful young woman with strong opinions and a growing confidence in expressing them. She challenged Samuel's assumptions about everything from cattle breeding to crop selection, and her fresh perspective often led to improvements in ranch operations. One snowy evening in February, as they sat around the fire after supper, Eleanor made an observation that would prove prophetic. "You know," she said, looking up from the book she'd been reading, "I think we've created something here that doesn't really have a name. We're not a traditional family, but we're more than just people sharing a house." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "We're a partnership of sorts, each contributing what we can for the benefit of all. It's like a small community," Catherine added. "Everyone has a role, everyone has value." Samuel considered their words as he stared into the dancing flames. They were right. What they'd built together defied easy categorization. It was part marriage, part business arrangement, part chosen family. But whatever it was, it worked. The revelation that would test the strength of their unusual bond came with the spring thaw, delivered by a letter that arrived with the first mail run after the winter's isolation. Samuel recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to his brother Thomas, whom he hadn't heard from in over 2 years. The letter was brief, but momentous. Thomas was coming west with his wife and children, looking for land to claim and a new start after losing his farm to debt and drought. He would arrive within the month and hoped to stay with Samuel while he established himself in the territory. Samuel shared the news with the sisters that evening, watching their faces carefully as he explained the situation. The house that had seemed spacious enough for 4 would be severely crowded with the addition of Thomas's family of 5. "Of course they must stay," Margaret said immediately, though Samuel could see her mind already working on the practical challenges. "Family is family. But where will everyone sleep?" Catherine asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. "We'll manage," Eleanor said firmly. "We've managed everything else." But Samuel could see the worry in their eyes, the fear that their carefully constructed life was about to be disrupted by forces beyond their control. He felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Responsibility not just for his brother's family, but for the 3 women who had become so much more than he'd ever expected. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. The sisters threw themselves into readying the house and ranch for the arrival of Thomas's family, but Samuel could sense an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. The security they'd found in their unusual arrangement suddenly felt fragile, threatened by the arrival of people who might not understand or accept what they'd built together. When Thomas finally arrived with his wife Mary and their 3 children, the reunion was both joyful and awkward. Samuel was genuinely happy to see his brother again, but he could see the confusion and disapproval in Mary's eyes as she tried to understand the household arrangements. "So you married the youngest one?" Mary asked during a private moment, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Samuel replied, though he realized how inadequate that simple answer was to explain the complexity of his relationship with Eleanor and her sisters. "And the other 2 just live here?" "They're family," Samuel said, using Margaret's words. "We take care of each other." Mary's expression suggested she found this explanation less than satisfactory, but she was too polite to press the issue further. However, Samuel could see that the arrival of his brother's family had introduced a new dynamic that would require careful navigation. The house, which had felt spacious and comfortable with 4 occupants, now strained to accommodate 9 people. Privacy became even more precious, and the easy rhythms they'd established were disrupted by the needs and schedules of 3 young children. Thomas, grateful for his brother's hospitality, threw himself into ranch work with enthusiasm, but his presence changed the balance of authority that had evolved between Samuel and the sisters. Most challenging of all was Mary's obvious discomfort with the unconventional nature of the household. She was a good woman, Samuel knew, but she'd been raised with strict ideas about propriety and family structure. The sight of 3 unmarried sisters living in apparent harmony with a man who was technically married to only one of them clearly troubled her. The tension came to a head one evening in late spring when Mary finally voiced her concerns directly. "Samuel," she said, approaching him as he worked on repairing a harness in the barn, "I need to speak with you about this situation." Samuel looked up from his work, though he continued stitching as she spoke. "What situation is that, Mary?" "This arrangement with the Whitmore sisters. It's not proper, Samuel. People in town are talking." "People always talk," Samuel replied mildly. "It doesn't change what we've built here." "But what have you built?" Mary pressed. "You're married to a girl who's barely more than a child, living with 2 other women who have no legal claim to be here. What happens when Eleanor grows up and wants a real marriage? What happens when the other sisters want families of their own?" The questions hit Samuel like physical blows because they were the same ones he'd been asking himself in the quiet hours before dawn. What they'd created worked for now, but was it sustainable? Could it survive the changes that time would inevitably bring? I don't know, he admitted finally. But I know that what we have now is good. These women have made my life better, and I hope I've done the same for them. Mary's expression softened slightly. I can see that you care for them, Samuel. But caring isn't enough. You need to think about their futures, about what's best for them in the long run. That night, Samuel lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the barn where he'd moved to make room for Thomas's family. Mary's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront questions he'd been avoiding. What did the future hold for Eleanor when she came of age? What about Margaret and Catherine, who deserved chances at happiness and families of their own? The next morning brought an unexpected answer to at least one of those questions. Margaret approached him as he worked on expanding the chicken coop, her expression serious but not troubled. Samuel, I need to discuss something with you, she said, settling on a nearby stump. Mr. Patterson has offered me a permanent position at the bank, with a significant increase in salary. Samuel paused in his hammering. That's wonderful news, Margaret. You've earned it. There's more, she continued. He's also expressed personal interest in me. He's asked permission to court me formally. The hammer slipped from Samuel's suddenly nerveless fingers. Of all the changes he'd imagined might come to their household, he hadn't considered that one of the sisters might find love and want to leave. How do you feel about that? He asked carefully. Margaret's smile was soft and genuine. I find that I'm quite fond of him as well. He's a good man, Samuel, and he understands the importance of family. He's made it clear that any arrangement between us would need to accommodate my responsibilities to my sisters. Samuel felt a complex mix of emotions: happiness for Margaret, concern about the household's future, and something that might have been relief. Perhaps the questions Mary had raised weren't as insurmountable as they'd seemed. Then you have my blessing, he said, and my gratitude for everything you've done for this family. The conversation with Margaret proved to be the first of several that would reshape their understanding of what their future might hold. Catherine, emboldened by her sister's example, admitted that she'd been corresponding with a widower in town who'd been purchasing her preserved goods at the market. Eleanor, meanwhile, had been accepted into a teacher training program that would allow her to continue her education while remaining in the territory. As summer progressed, the household began to evolve once again. Margaret's courtship with Mr. Patterson proceeded with the same careful deliberation she brought to everything else, but it was clear that a wedding was in their future. Catherine's friendship with the widower, a gentleman named Robert who had 2 young children, was developing into something deeper. Even Thomas and Mary seemed to be settling into the rhythm of ranch life, with Thomas proving to be a valuable partner in expanding the operation. But it was Eleanor's growth that affected Samuel most profoundly. The shy girl who had stepped off the stagecoach was becoming a confident young woman with clear ideas about her future. She spoke passionately about education and the importance of bringing learning to frontier communities. Her intelligence, which had been evident in her letters, was now matched by a maturity that made Samuel realize their relationship would need to evolve as well. The conversation that would define their future came on a warm August evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor had been quiet during supper, and Samuel sensed she had something important to say. Samuel, she began, her voice steady but thoughtful, I've been thinking about our marriage, about what it means and what it should become. Samuel felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice calm. What have you been thinking? I think we entered into this arrangement for practical reasons. I needed security, and you needed companionship, but I believe we've both grown beyond those original needs. Samuel nodded, unsure where she was leading but willing to follow. I care for you deeply, Eleanor continued, but I'm not sure it's the kind of love that makes for a true marriage, and I think you feel the same way. The relief that washed over Samuel was so intense it surprised him. I do care for you, Eleanor, but you're right. What we have is more like a deep friendship, a partnership. Exactly, Eleanor said, smiling. So I have a proposal. What if we dissolved our marriage legally but remained family in every other way? You could be free to find real love, and so could I when I'm ready. But we would still be connected, still be part of each other's lives. The idea was radical, even scandalous by the standards of their time and place. But as Samuel considered it, he realized it made perfect sense for their unique situation. What about your sisters? He asked. What about the ranch, the life we've built here? Margaret will marry Mr. Patterson, but she's already spoken to him about maintaining close ties with us. Catherine is falling in love with Robert, but she feels the same way. And as for me, I want to teach to make a difference in this territory, but I also want to remain part of this family we've created. Samuel looked out over the land he'd claimed and worked, thinking about the changes that had transformed his solitary existence into something rich and complex. It would be unconventional, he said finally. Everything about us has been unconventional, Eleanor replied with a laugh. Why stop now? The decision to dissolve the marriage while maintaining their family bonds was met with varying reactions from the community. Some were scandalized, others were confused, but many who had come to know the household understood that what they'd built transcended traditional categories. Margaret's wedding to Mr. Patterson in September was a celebration that brought together the entire community. The ceremony was held at the ranch, with Catherine managing the feast and Eleanor playing the piano that had been Thomas's wedding gift to the couple. Samuel walked Margaret down the aisle, proud to give away the woman who had become like a sister to him. Catherine's engagement to Robert was announced at the wedding reception, and plans were made for a spring ceremony. Eleanor began her teacher training with enthusiasm, traveling to town 3 days a week for classes while continuing to help manage the ranch. As autumn settled over the prairie once again, Samuel reflected on the extraordinary year that had transformed his life. The mail-order bride he'd expected had become something far more valuable, a family bound not by law or blood, but by choice and mutual respect. Thomas and Mary had decided to claim land adjacent to Samuel's ranch, creating a small community of related families. Margaret and her new husband had purchased a house in town but visited the ranch regularly. Catherine continued to live at the ranch while planning her wedding, and Eleanor divided her time between her studies and her work as an unofficial teacher for the children in the area. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of an extended family that defied easy definition, but worked beautifully in practice. Samuel had found not just companionship, but purpose and joy in ways he'd never imagined possible. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Eleanor had cried over the letter about her childhood home, Samuel found her once again sitting on the porch steps, but this time she was smiling as she read a letter from one of her former students in town. "Good news?" Samuel asked, settling beside her. "The best," Eleanor replied. "Little Mary Patterson, no relation to your Margaret's husband, has learned to read. Her mother writes that she's reading everything she can get her hands on." Samuel smiled, understanding the deep satisfaction Eleanor found in her teaching. "You've found your calling." "I think we all have," Eleanor said, looking out over the ranch that had become home to so many. "We've created something here that I don't think any of us could have imagined when we first stepped off that stagecoach." "No regrets?" Samuel asked. Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. "About leaving Boston? About the unconventional path we've taken? No regrets at all. We've built something beautiful here, something that works for all of us." As winter approached once again, the household prepared for the season with the confidence of people who had learned to adapt and thrive. The challenges that had once seemed insurmountable had been met with creativity and determination. The family that had begun as a desperate arrangement had evolved into something stronger and more flexible than traditional structures. Samuel Morrison had sought a mail-order bride to ease his loneliness, but he'd received something far more valuable, a chosen family that had taught him the true meaning of love, partnership, and community. The three sisters who had declared "we come as one" had indeed remained united, but they'd also grown into independent women with their own dreams and futures. On Christmas Eve, as the extended family gathered around the fireplace in the ranch house, Samuel looked around at the faces illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. Margaret and her husband, Catherine and Robert with his children, Eleanor with her books and plans, Thomas and Mary with their growing family, all connected by the bonds they'd chosen to forge and maintain. The mail-order bride arrangement that had brought them together was long dissolved, but the family it had created would endure. They had learned that love came in many forms, that family could be chosen as well as born, and that the most unconventional arrangements could sometimes produce the most beautiful results. As the wind howled across the Montana prairie outside, the house was filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of people who had found their place in the world. Samuel Morrison was no longer the lonely rancher who had written desperate letters to Eastern newspapers. He was the patriarch of a family that had redefined what it meant to belong to each other. The story that had begun with three sisters stepping off a stagecoach and declaring, "We come as one," had evolved into something none of them could have predicted, a testament to the power of adaptation, the strength of chosen bonds, and the endless possibilities that opened when people were willing to write their own rules for love and family. In the end, Samuel realized, the best mail-order bride arrangement was the one that had grown beyond its original boundaries to become something entirely new, a family built on respect, sustained by mutual support, and strengthened by the courage to choose love in all its many forms.